Excellent. So, topic today, my shallow saltwater pond. Um, some of you may be aware that there are videos on YouTube shot by a number of different people. You have Richard Back aficionado, Worldwide Corals, Polo Reef. I've had a few people visit and film this pond. And I pay attention to the questions that show up after the YouTube videos, and I had attempted to address some of those questions when filming those videos, but many of them end up sort of disappearing on the editing floor. But lucky you, you're here. Here I am live in person, and I am going to tell you all about the history of how this pond came together. How I am not a perfect person, just like all of you, and how very often when I put together an aquarium, it's sort of cobbled and not well planned, and some things work and some things don't. So you're going to get the raw and understanding of how this whole thing came together, plus some of the inspiration that I had in thinking about building this little pond. And then lastly, what I have in mind for the future. Two Little Fishies is my company, in case you didn't know. So we'll get right into the whole inspiration thing while I let some people sit down. One of the first ones that comes to mind is the Waikiki Aquarium Edge of the Reef that was put together by Bruce Carlson. I, in fact, saw it in the initial phases as he was planning it and building it, and it was really fun to watch it develop. If you've ever been out to Honolulu to visit it, it's maybe not quite what it was when he was there, but it looked like this when I saw it last. This is, as you can see, out in the natural sunlight, and the pond is full of native Hawaiian corals. Most of what's there is Montipora, or Montipora, however you want to say it. This actually was not what I had in mind building for my pond, and I will evolve and explain that, but this is a magnificent, beautiful display. It looks like nature. You can see all the rock work above and around the pond. Also, there are windows looking into it. It's slightly below ground, mostly above ground, and it's, as I said, full of corals and full of fish. Another exhibit that I saw was in Eilat, Israel, at Coral World. And I'll show you, these are a couple of pictures that are available online if you Google Coral World. There you can see the underwater observatory in the Red Sea, and there's a nice shallow saltwater pond with corals. There's a close-up, and you can see not only corals, there's the native tridacnid clams and a lot of fish. This also was not what I had in mind. But it's, you know, showing you what you could do in natural sunlight. Now, this is a photograph also at Coral World in Eilat, and you won't find this one online because I took this picture back in 1997. And I loved this pond. Now, it's not as beautiful as the one I just showed you before, but this one totally knocked me out because look at that beautiful white sand bed in the bright, bright sunlight, and the herd of diadema urchins and the black sea cucumber cleaning it. And there were some corals, not a lot of coral. And I thought, wow, someday I'd love to do something like that. Another thing that inspired me, back in the late 1980s, I was graduating from college, and I wanted to work at the Smithsonian Institution because Walter Adey was working with growing corals in a what they called a microcosm at that time. And when I interviewed with some people there, it's a long story, but I'll just cut to the chase. They also took me downstairs into the basement in the Smithsonian, where off exhibit, Walter Adey had a Chesapeake Bay marsh system and a Florida Everglades system, and they totally blew me away. Really amazing things that there aren't really any pictures of to show you. This picture is available online. Walter Adey there on the left with Robert Redford who was visiting a off-site exhibit, Everglades ecosystem that Walter built. And they were really amazing. I also had the great fortune to see similar systems that Walter Adey was involved with at Biosphere 2. I consulted there in Tucson, Arizona. So these influenced my thinking on what I had in mind for my pond. A related inspiration, although I saw this after I had already built my pond, if you have a chance to go to Holland, you should really visit the Burger Zoo. The whole zoo is wonderful, amazing place. And they have a mangrove exhibit there. And it's not just a little pretty tank with a few mangroves in it. It's a whole greenhouse with butterflies flying around with this basically mangrove ecosystem with mud and horseshoe crabs and fiddler crabs and birds. And it's the Florida Everglades in Holland. Absolutely amazing. And by the way, you know, look here, there's a stream. It's like a river running through it. A nice gentle flow, strong enough that it's suspending the muds, which you could imagine would be useful for filter feeders. How well thought out this is, and it has tides. Fantastic. When I say local, I just gave this talk for the Florida Marine Aquarium Society, so I mean South Florida inspiration. There were a couple of outdoor exhibits that I have seen over the years. One was Joe Biesterfeld's, it's a hobbyist in Fort Lauderdale, and Joe Waiulo, Sanjay Yoshi, and I had a chance to visit that back, oh gosh, in the early 2000s, I think it was. So, you know, almost 20 years ago, I got to see it, and there's a photo I'll show you. Next slide. Dick Boyd, many of you are familiar with that name. He had a reef aquarium in his garage, basically. It took over most of his garage, and it was naturally lit by sunlight. And he connected several refugia that were next to the garage on his property, where he grew giant clams and caulerpa and had, you know, a lot of interesting thing. And that was much more similar to my pond than actually the other ones I showed you earlier. Here's Joe Biesterfeld's pond in Fort Lauderdale. As you can see, it's got cast concrete and some stone. It's something like the Waikiki one, but adding a little further, he had a waterfall in it. There you can see Joe and Sanjay looking at it. And it started out with dead rock and some dead corals, but bit by bit he added live corals from his reef aquarium, which were the reef aquariums inside the house. Natural sunlight, and he used a chiller to maintain it. I think this is still running, but I haven't seen it lately. The Steinhardt Aquarium has some also very inspirational exhibits that were, this one in particular was sort of the moment where I said, I am going to get my damn pond set up. I wanted to do this. You can see mangrove roots, bare sand, and blue-spotted stingray. And I said, you know, just imagine that in the front entrance to my house. You got three things there. Very, very focused concept. But talking, I don't remember, was it to you, Rich, or to Charles? I can't remember. I spoke to someone basically about the size. My pond is 11 feet long, 4 feet wide, 18 inches deep. And I was advised that the blue-spotted stingray would outgrow that. It would be too small for it. So I scratched the idea of the blue-spotted stingray, kept it in the back of my mind that maybe someday when I build a bigger pond, I'll do it. But it's a goal of mine. I'd love to duplicate this. The upside-down jellyfish, Cassiopeia, very, very simple to keep this jellyfish, much more so than other types of jellyfish. They have symbiotic zooxanthellae, just like corals do. They live in a shallow, barely moving body of water. You can feed them Artemia nauplii or prepared dried foods, or you can not feed them at all, just give them light. And so I had in mind to have this in my pond because I didn't plan on having a strong water velocity either. In addition, there's this off the side of the big reef tank display at Steinhardt with giant clams. Giant clams in natural sunlight, looking down on them, that is a winner wherever it is. So this was something I had in mind. And there at the Steinhardt, as in my own pond, you can see it's common to have diatoms on the sand bed, but there are ways of dealing with that we can talk about. Anemones as well are beautiful in a pond type display. This was something I wanted to really bring home. Here's a photograph at Bear Cut in Miami, and you know, obviously mangroves there, but here is that shallow near shore zone. Not much growing on that sand there, but this is the kind of place where you would find Cassiopeia, or if the system was large enough for it, you know, you could find stingrays of various types. So, start date, March of 2017. I'll just mention, roll back a little bit, about 2 years of planning, as I say. Planning really was thinking about it, talking about it, saying I'm going to do it. Not a whole lot of sketching, but a whole lot of digging. I didn't actually hire anybody to dig this out. I had some people who visited who did that, who said, "Oh yeah, I'll bring a bunch of guys. We'll dig out your pond. We'll bang it out in a weekend." I'm like, yeah, okay, maybe, yeah, all right. But I had a wheelbarrow, I had a shovel, and it actually took a lot longer than I imagined. You know, I would dig at it for a while. It's only 18 inches deep, but yeah. I don't have a lot of spare time, and I would do it, and then I'd quit, do a little bit more. And my wife, you know, when we'd have company over, she'd point at that big ditch in the front, right by the front door, and say, you know, if I disappear, that's where you'll find me. Okay, so it's about 500 gallons in total. Which is not a lot of water when you think about it for that much space, which is cool. That means it's got really good gas exchange. So you're privileged to see my filtration room for the pond. Yeah, no. But I could have done something more like this, you know, like pool filters on the side of the house. But, you know, I thought about it, and I had actually seen a pond in Miami Beach that had a filtration system, something like this. And that pond is no longer there, by the way, but mine is still there. And so this is what I did. I had an old 30-gallon tank, and it just so happened that it fit in this spot. And is there a pointer here? Is there a laser pointer? No. Anybody? No laser pointer? Okay, well, I have fingers. That's concrete, and it's attached to a whole lot more concrete. And so when I was digging with the shovel, I couldn't get past that. And so I, you know, took the measurement here. You know, that's sort of part of the wall there. And it just so happened that I had this tank that I wasn't using, and it fit. And I thought to myself, well, gee, the tank is old and it's silicone seals and it'll probably break someday, but all right, I'll set it up and we'll see. You know, this way we can prove out the pond, and it's still there to this day. So it's a liability at this point. Needs to be taken out. But, you know, and the truth is, for the 500-gallon tank, the 30-gallon sump is too small. You know, but it works. Does it work great? No, but it works. So that's the whole setup there running. Very gentle, not a lot of mixing. And here's what it looks like tidied up and covered. I've got shells. You know, when you buy Reborn, our media Reborn, and you know nobody wants shells in their calcium reactors, I actually have employees that pick the shells, and that's where they go in my garden in different places, and it's mind-boggling. You know, if you were to visit me, I can show you. I mean, how much, and to think that each one was picked by hand, one all benefiting me. Okay, in addition, you're diluting the salt out, so you need to add salt back. There's a lot of different ways that you could do it. You could create a brine reservoir and have another pump topping off. You can top off with a 2-part solution like Sea Balance, and that keeps up with some of the salt, but probably not enough. There's a lot of ways you could do this. But in any case, it's what I'm doing. And there is the freshwater reservoir and the Kimura pump, just to show that. People ask me about the sunlight, you know, how much of the pond gets illuminated by the sunlight. Well, from May through July, this much. You can see that the walkway here shades that section there, which is kind of cool because you can put something that's shade-loving along that section. But other times of the year, only part of the pond gets illuminated by the sun. And this time of year, well, we're already getting out of it. I would say December and January through mid-February, I never have any full sun. It's just indirect light. It looks more like this most of the time. Now, that indirect light is probably brighter than the light in most of your aquariums. It's something that's relative to our eyes. We don't appreciate it. Have I measured the part? No, but I'm telling you it's plenty of light. You can see my main reef display right there through the window. So the pond and the reef display are parallel. There's sort of synergy in the universe that way, right? There's also a freshwater display here that's shaped like an L, so that kind of connects them, right? Anyway, I don't have that mangrove in there. This is back in 2017, and I grow mangroves, by the way, in case you don't know that, and I have a lot of them in different sizes. And I thought that one was a little bit too small for the aesthetic. This is the same one, though, a different view, just showing looking down the length and the water flowing over the overflow into the sump. This is the mangrove that ended up in the display, or in the pond. And it's before I put it in. This is also in 2017. Now, if you look in the pond, you'll notice actually seagrass. I had planted seagrass propagules that you can harvest in the Florida Keys, and they grew just beautifully in the natural sunlight. And another reason I'm showing this image right here is a photosynthetic sponge. Some of you may have it. It typically enters our aquariums with colonies of zoanthid anemones. And it's a dark grayish black, and it's photosynthetic, grows up like little tubes. Some of you have seen this, right? I like it. It grows really well in the pond. And unfortunately, shortly thereafter, in 2017, we had Hurricane Irma. And that dumped a whole bunch of rain in the pond. And it killed that sponge. So now the pond can handle quite a lot of rain, which I'll talk to you about later. But this is what it looked like when I came back. I didn't have that mangrove in there at that time. The mangrove was where I grow mangroves on the side of the house. This from a palm tree. There were leaves and all. It was just basically a disaster. But aside from that sponge, everything else was alive. I had giant clams in there at that time, and they were fine. I live on a canal on Miami Beach, and it's a saltwater canal. Needless to say, after Hurricane Irma, it was kind of a brackish water canal. But I was able to take that sponge out, do a water change, hook up a generator and maintain the water flow. And I was able to use the pond to rescue the corals that were in my display tank in the house. It was a better place to keep them. They were getting light, and we were without power for 10 days. You can look online. There's a video where I talk about what happened with Hurricane Irma, and I talk about being prepared, ways that you can maintain an aquarium in a natural disaster like that. But the pond was really helpful. There you can see two of the fish that survived. Those are two males from two pairs of clownfish. The females in both pairs passed away in Irma, and these two males have now bonded, and the black Ocellaris turned into a female, and they're still going strong. That black Ocellaris I bought in 1996 in Pittsburgh, and so it's amazing, still going. The Percula in 2017 was already 10 years old, so now 15 years old. So more recently, the pond looks like this, as you can see, nice and tidied up, and much more bigger clams. And so I guess we can talk a little. I don't remember whether I get into the freshwater thing, but I wanted to show you the mangrove planted, and it's grown in quite a lot. Yeah, rain. That's a question people have all the time. How do you, well, I talked about water top-off, that I exceed the rate of evaporation. Ponds could have an issue of runoff from adjacent soil. I don't have that issue because it's, there in front of the house and I have a walkway. I do get some, not much, a little bit of runoff from the roof. It hasn't been an issue, but it could be for some people. So here's my quick, dirty paper napkin drawing of how I deal with rain. I'm not saying that rain doesn't dilute the pond. It does, but not much. I've had 6 inches, 10 inches of rain and checked, and the salinity just, barely budges, goes down a little bit. But if you get 2, 3, 4 inches of rain today, tomorrow, the next day, then it's a problem, and I need to add salt, and I keep on top of it. Bear in mind that with my RO water top off, I need to pay attention as well. About once a month, I need to add salt. And I do it simply this way because I haven't had the time to set up a brine tank reservoir and do something about it. So 2 little fishies, I literally manufacture synthetic seawater mix Accuracy 1. So easy enough to just take some home, 5-gallon bucket. I scoop water out of the pond, so it's already salt water, and I add several scoops of the synthetic salt in while it's mixing. Let it clear in a few minutes, and then I have a brine which I can then slowly pour in and use the bucket to mix it so that I'm not concentrating a brine on anything in the tank. And I do that, several times. It's labor intensive. It's definitely not the way to do it long term. So setting up some kind of a brine tank, automatic, with a pump to do the mixing, so you have a spare 50 or 100 gallons of brine with a top-off dosing pump, would be the right way to do this. I'll get around to that. Calcium and alkalinity maintenance. I mentioned Sea Balance, which is a 2-part calcium and alkalinity maintenance product that also raises salinity. That at the moment is the way that I'm maintaining calcium and alkalinity. But if you weren't diluting the system the way I am, Kalkwasser would be a simple way to maintain calcium and alkalinity, probably the preferred way. Of course, you could use a calcium reactor, but again, the system wasn't set up for growing a lot of corals, although I do have some corals, as I'll show you in a moment. Temperature maintenance. You got all that sunlight. You're in South Florida. How do you keep it from getting too hot? And then what about winter? Well, yeah. Fortunately, when you put a pond in the ground, it's insulated, and that helps a lot. But it's not completely the way to maintain temperature. You do need a chiller for a system this small, and I did buy this chiller, and yeah, you can see I'm maintaining it at 77. In summertime, in August, when we get super hot and have a lot of sun, it will go up to about 83 degrees. And in wintertime, as I show you afterwards how I deal with it, I'm able to maintain it in the mid-70s. And this is the wintertime solution, exercise mats. So I don't maintain the pond with exercise mats all the time, but when we get a forecast that says we're going to have a cold front to bring the temperature down into the 50s at night, I need to put the mats on. 60s, I don't. The ground insulation will keep it from falling too low. When it's 65 or 62 degrees outside, no problem. My pond will still be in the 70s. But 55 degrees, I need to put these mats on. And I cover it like that. It doesn't have to be 100% covered. Notice how the mats are conveniently the same width as the pond. See, I planned well, right? Anyway, it works. I also have a couple of 200-watt fixed temperature heaters in the sump. They're only about that long each. And in winter, I keep them plugged in all the time. So that gives me a little bit of extra heating capacity. They're not there in summer, obviously. Okay, about corals. So I say story of 2 corals. I do have more than 2 corals in there, but I want to mention these. These are in the display inside. As you can see, those are corals that are too big and need to come out. Here's a top view of that display, and you can see the Echinopora. You know, it's pretty. It's beautiful coral, but it's too big. And you know, not just wide that way, it was really big. And so I thought, well, I'm going to take it out. I'll frag some bits off of it, and let's see how it does in the pond. So I put it in the pond. It was a whole big production to be able to get it out from underneath the lights that were over it and get up over the lip of the tank. And then with my wife carrying a bucket underneath it and everything, because it didn't really fit in that piece there. So I put it in the pond, and that's just the moment it went in. You can see that it's off to its side. I set it up straight, and it looked beautiful. And I thought, I wonder if this will live. And within a few days, we had a bunch of rain. And as you can see, it's tall. And remember that fresh water floats on top theory? Well, it does. And when the coral, which is a fixed organism, is reaching up all the way into that freshwater lens, not a good thing. So that rain killed the top of the Echinopora. And those of you who know, Echinopora is one of those corals that forms brown jelly when it dies. So I looked at that big brown jelly top and said, got to take it out. So that's a nice curio specimen. I took the whole piece out. Remember, I'd fragged some bits off it. And this is Sprung Stunner, which is available in the hobby everywhere. So, and that represented, at that moment, just a few years of growth. You know, from 2017 when we had Hurricane Irma to that moment, I had this big piece. So no big loss to kill it that way. But it was interesting to realize that if I'm going to put corals in the pond, they can't be anywhere near the surface. I also have some gorgonians in there, and they've grown up to the surface, and when it rains, the top branches die. Same thing. Lower branches are fine. So here's that Ceratopora guttatus, which you can find from Oceans, Reefs, and Aquariums, or ORA, common in the trade. I figured I'd put in there, what the heck. I had no thought that this thing was going to survive in there, but I had no place to put it, and you know, nobody visiting to just frag it up. And it's thriving in there. So here it is in this system that runs relatively lower salinity than my reef tank, relatively lower alkalinity and calcium, and it grows. It's happy, and it has almost no water flow. Who would have thought Ceratopora, right? but live and learn. In front of it, you can see a Montipora. I forget the name of that in the trade. That's the green one with orange polyps. It's like Christmas or something, right? You guys just don't recognize it because here it is in Season's Greeting. Thank you. Under actinic light, fluorescent green, fluorescent orange polyps, this is what it looks like in sunlight. It's thriving in there. The only problem it has is that the diadema urchins in there occasionally graze it. I have Turbinaria in there, and Kevin Cohen, wherever you are, those are some of the beautiful Springer-eyed damselfish. Both types there, because I have the solid blue one and then the wonderful black with blue pattern ones that I just recently got from him in Quality Marine. Boy, they look great in the sunlight. In any case, Turbinaria, these are all frags from the colonies that I have in my main display. Turbinaria loves it in the pond. It does great. You can see some silt settling in the center. If you've ever gone diving in a lagoon habitat in nature, that's exactly what you see on corals. It's very common, but it'll often, if you leave it alone, kill it, whereas in corals you get storms and that washes that off. So I get in there once in a while to, swipe that off of them, make sure it doesn't cause any necrosis, but otherwise they grow really well in the pond. Related to Turbinaria, of course, is Duncanopsamia, and I put this colony of Duncanopsamia in the pond back in 2017 to rescue it so I wouldn't lose it after the power outage from Hurricane Irma, and I never put it back in the main display. It looks so beautiful in the natural sunlight, and it's happy. So, yeah, there you go. This shot shows a Sticodactyla that we all know as Haddonii, which Joe Rowlett is educating us that Haddonii is really Gigantea, which is confusing, but it's true. And I put this specimen in there, beautiful, beautiful one that I bought, I think here or at Reefapalooza. And it did well for quite some time, but I went on a trip probably for another trade show, and it migrated out of the pot where I put it in there, and it landed on that. That's a sponge, which is called Lebdenfeldia, but in the trade it's known as Colospongia or ear sponge. I keep some things in the pond that I would not recommend in a reef tank. I find them interesting organisms. They can be invasive or problematic in a reef tank, but it's easy to deal with on a sand bed. Turns out that they're not compatible with carpet anemones. The carpet anemone kills the sponge, and the sponge kills the carpet anemone. Not a good thing. Anyway, somebody told me afterwards that they actually use carpet anemones to kill Lebdenfeldia. They don't leave it in contact. Well, they got in contact too long, and I ended up losing the carpet, unfortunately. Lessons learned. Giant clams do really, really well in the sunlight. That's one from ORA, bright green Durasa. Feather duster worms do well. I bought this trio, or four, it's more than three, here at Reefstock. I forget how many years ago. It was on a colony of Montipora. And yeah, I saw that and thought, wow, yeah, I want to put that in my pond, and it's happy. Zoanthid anemones, of course, do really well, and I've planted them on the base of the branches or the roots of the mangrove, and they grow up onto the roots just like you'll find them in nature. You can see a small Cassiopeia there toward the front bottom, and there's a Elysia starfish behind. So there's a lot of creatures in the system. Banggai cardinalfish, wonderful combination, diadema sea urchins and Banggai cardinals and tridacnid clams. So this looks like a photo in Indonesia, but that's you can take your iPhone and dip it into an aquarium, or in this case into the pond, and take what looks like an underwater photo. And if you have a school of bangais, it doesn't take long before lots of little babies, if you feed the bangais enough. So they do breed in there. And the population waxes and wanes. I have to feed the sea urchins. As I mentioned, if I don't feed the sea urchins enough, they graze the coral. So I'm able to collect local red seaweeds, Laurencia and others, and put them in the pond. And something I discovered shortly after I tried that, the ragged sea hare lays its eggs on the red seaweed. You don't really notice it, but in a short period of time after adding the red seaweed, suddenly you've got ragged sea hares. They grow unbelievably fast, to this size in a matter of weeks. So, and they just show up and they feed on other algae as well, and eventually peter out. I've not seen them last more than about 2 months. The Florida fighting conch is a wonderful creature to add to a pond if you have a sand substrate. They're great at feeding on diatoms, and they burrow through the sand, so they're moving the sand around. I've got 2 of them in there that I've had for about 4 years now.
How big are they, Julian?
This size. They are available, thanks for asking, they are available sometimes aquaculture. For the trade. And there are other Stromba species, other conchs available, really great for maintenance of a sand bed. There is a sea biscuit in the center of this photo, even though you see that starfish in your brain saying, Julian's making a mistake there. No, I'm not. The starfish is trying to point out the sea biscuit, which is under the sand, and it looks like that. I collected 2 sea biscuits together with the fighting conchs. They were from the same place. I was diving with Colin Ford from Coral Morphologic, and saw them and said, I'm going to try these in my pond. And as I said, it's about 4 years ago, and they're doing great. And they, clean up the sand bed, which needs it. I also added a number of Holothuria sea cucumbers, and I have way more quantity than I originally added. So these multiply in the aquarium. I'm not sure how. You don't find tiny babies, but you find small ones, maybe this size. There seems to be some kind of asexual budding, but it's not like the big one just splits in half. Something that produces small ones. And you really can see them at night. They come out to feed more at night. Great for processing the sand. And you could imagine with an outdoor pond, you get a fair amount of dust from the air in there, aside from algae growing on the sand bed. So they're constantly turning it over and keeping it, I wouldn't call it clean, but keeping it healthy. I have collected grass shrimp. In Miami, you can pass a net through a seagrass bed and collect all sorts of grass shrimp. And they will include the edible shrimp, Penaeid shrimps. And when I collect them, they're tiny. Something I discovered that surprised me is that within months, they go from tiny to edible size. So people who farm shrimp in ponds, it's probably a pretty quick turnaround for them, because, I do feed the Bangai cardinals, but I'm not actively feeding these shrimps, so they're finding enough to eat. They might be feeding on bristleworms, which of course multiply in a sand bed. You can see them in the pond at night. If you shine a flashlight, their eyes glow. So I always have some edible shrimp in the pond. Ornamental macroalgae, it's a great subject now. I think that's growing in the hobby is sort of a niche. Apart from growing corals, growing ornamental macroalgae, and a pond is a perfect place to grow them, unless you have diadema sea urchins. Before I added the diadema, I put one of the beautiful caulerpas that you can find in Florida, Paspaloides. It forms fronds that look like palm trees, and they're like that tall. It was perfect in this pond, but when I added the diadema, or diademas, they grazed it right down. The lettuce sea slug is another a herbivore you can find in Florida. It's available in the trade. They feed on green algae, but they also incorporate some of the chloroplasts in their tissue, so they're photosynthetic. I added some of these, and they multiplied in the system. Unfortunately, they don't do that perpetually. So you add 4 or 5, it doesn't take long to have 30 or 40, and then none. I don't know why. As I mentioned, I live on the canal, and I can do a plankton tow in the backyard, and I did that. I added some live plankton, and I got sea squirts to settle out in the pond. And they persisted for quite a while, more than a year, but eventually petered out. I don't know if the urchins grazed them. I'm not sure. But they were really quite nice in that shaded area where the walkway is shading. Sponges, as I mentioned, do really well in there. I didn't take more pictures. I have a variety of different sponges thriving in the pond. Seagrass does extremely well, but the diadema grazed all of this down. So diadema are bad. Why do I have them in there? Well, they look cool, and they also help prevent problematic algae from being a problem. When I first set up the pond, I did have a bloom of bryopsis, which sort of defeated my promises to my wife that the pond was not going to be ugly and problematic. You know, when she saw me wading in the pond and pulling out handfuls of bryopsis, she was like, "I thought you told me that this was going to be easy." And I said, "Well, this will go away. When? I promise it'll go away." And it did. And the diadema were part of that, that change. But as you know, sometimes there's sort of a progression from new pond or new aquarium to mature aquarium. Little observation on head and lateral line erosion. I had a purple tang in a 60-gallon aquarium at the office, which was really too small for it. It was stressed, and it developed that scalloping of the dorsal and anal fin, as well as, it's not quite dark enough in here to see it, but right there a little bit of, and here, a little bit of lateral line erosion. The two symptoms are associated with each other. And I put it in the pond, and within months it had recovered. There's still a little bit of the, you can see that there, when it grew back, it didn't pigment as darkly as the rest of the fish, but it's basically in good shape now, and happy to be in a much, much bigger system. In this case, I would rank stress as being the major driver as to why this head and lateral line erosion developed in this fish. There are multiple causes for this syndrome, which is the right way to describe head and lateral line erosion. Diet is a factor in some cases. Bullying, which can affect stress as well as diet, because if you're a yellow tang in a system that has other yellow tangs, and the bully yellow tang gets to eat all the food and you don't, then you're going to have a dietary as well as a stress issue, and this will happen. There may be other factors in water quality as well. Some reports have shown that for certain fish, dust from activated carbon may stimulate this. I also know that copper medications will also initiate this. You can see that happen at wholesale facilities. Stress may be a factor, cofactor with that. So there are numerous causes, but this disease still hasn't been fully researched to understand what is happening on the cellular level. It has always fascinated me, and a little tidbit you may not know, first time I was published in Freshwater and Marine Aquarium magazine, I was 15 years old and had written an article for a local Florida Marine Aquarium Society newsletter. It got picked up by FAMA magazine, where I talked about curing this in a hepatis tang. So it's a subject that has interested me most of my life. Common outdoor pond problems. This is whether fresh or saltwater. Birds. I had a damselfish that had gone from various. He was in various aquariums. Wasn't one of the big golden damsels, but it looked like that. I forget what the species name is. Um, it's probably the Moluccan one that gets about that big, high dorsal fin. Thanks. Is it Ambliglyphodon, right? Is the genus something like that? And I'd had this fish for probably 6-7 years and decided to put it in the pond. And they swim up high in the water column compared to other damsels. And I noticed one day that there was an egret. I was going to work in the morning, and there was an egret above the pond looking in, and I thought, maybe risky. And I really couldn't catch the fish out, but he could, and he did. But I have not lost any other fish since. So other fishes that I have, including the Bangais, stay low enough that birds, yeah, they've given up. I haven't really seen any birds trying. I have not had issues with raccoons, but I know other people who have outdoor aquariums or ponds. Raccoons have gotten in, and they can catch fish. They really can. Iguanas don't really bother anything, but we really have a lot of iguanas in Miami Beach, and I have come home on a number of occasions and had, there was an iguana just sort of near the pond, and it gets startled, and the iguana just jumped right into the pond. At the canal, when they see me, they're up on the seawall and jump right in the pond and into the canal and swim away. And when they go into the pond, they really can't go anywhere. So they, knock things over and run around, and that has happened. Airborne dust I mentioned earlier. This is something that you have to deal with in outdoor pond situation. So I'm almost done. I hope I'm close to 1 hour. I hope I haven't run over. Future plans, when people visited, I point out that, you've got that liner. I built the pond with a liner. I didn't mention that other people had suggested that I pour concrete, put rebar, and I just said, I don't know if this is going to work. Let me test it out. Let me just go simple, cheap, and dirty, plywood and a liner, and that's how it's been all the while. But I'm happy with it. But I don't like the fact that you can see the liner, and I want to do some stonework around the pond to hide that, and do something that looks more like this, although this is above ground. We have natural limestone in South Florida called Keystone. We also have the oolitic limestone like Marco Rocks or like our stacks, and it's a natural, local, quarried material, and it can be quite beautiful. It can look like this, and I planned on, decorating the entrance to our house where, currently I have the brick. You saw that in that earlier photo, and the combination of the limestone and the brick, I think, looks quite nice. And that's just the local oolitic limestone. Aside from stonework, I can add additional filtration. I can go from the sump and pump to that chiller. As you know, I could be pumping to another filter. I can add carbon filtration because the water is quite yellow. I could add an algae filter, not only to remove nutrients, but to grow the algae instead of collecting the algae and grow food for the diadema. I don't currently have artificial light, so I'm not able to look at the pond at night without a flashlight, but I could add something. I don't have room there for a bigger pond, but maybe someday, somewhere, I'll build something bigger and be able to have my dream of having a blue-spotted stingray. I wanted to mention also this wonderful, it's not exactly a pond, but it's kind of a pond that you can see at the Scripps Aquarium. How many of you have seen this one? Hey, quite a few. Is that not one of the most amazing exhibits in a public aquarium? I mean, really. So natural sunlight, and it's really designed as a tide pool. So on the right side there, in that sort of little mountain, there's a wave maker, and it sends waves in, and you get these beautiful swirling eddies. It's exactly like nature. And so many different types of macroalgae are in there, and sea anemones. Of course, it's cold water, but you could do this with a warm water pond, and then it would be something more like what Bruce Carlson did in Waikiki. But I love this. I would love to make something like this at home. And also want to put a shout out to Worldwide Corals and their indoor lagoon, which was inspired by my own indoor mangrove systems and my pond. And this system is chock full of corals. So this would require more in the way of filtration, protein skimming, activated carbon, much more water circulation, and much more careful maintenance of calcium, alkalinity, and salinity. Totally different goals. And what a beautiful result that they have. I bring it up to just show you that my pond was not designed to be a be-all. You can't keep everything in it. I was looking for something much simpler, and that is something that I was able to achieve. That's my talk. Feel free to ask questions. Thanks. Yeah. Chris?
How much evaporation are you getting a day?
It varies a lot. We have a fair amount of humidity most of the time in Miami. But when we get a cold front and the air dries, it evaporates quite a bit. I would guess in the neighborhood of 5 or 6 gallons a day when it's low humidity, and probably more like, I don't know, a gallon or so, maybe 2 on a typical day at most.
That's hilarious, because I evaporate more than that just in my indoor temperature. Once I already get home.
Yeah, right. Well, we have, you've got probably the lower humidity going on. We have a fair amount. So.
What's the difference between, or is there a difference between Julian Stunner and Hollywood Stunner?
I have pictures that could show that. Maybe on my phone I could. The Sprung Stunner is a lighter green, and there's more contrast between it's sort of a browny green, and then the polyps are fluorescent green. The Hollywood Stunner, the whole coral is much more fluorescent green. It's also thicker, so it calcifies more. The Hollywood Stunner grows fast, but more slowly than the Sprung Stunner. Let me see, what other... It doesn't tend to grow in as tight a whirling growth. It's more open, the Hollywood Stunner. Other than that, under certain conditions, I'm sure they would be harder to tell apart.
And there's some that grow sort of roughly, almost looks like pavona.
Yeah.
Sort of ruffles, and then one, you saw when I posted that one on Facebook, because I called it a beautiful POS.
Yeah, painted piece. Yeah, right. They put out long sweeper tentacles. That's right. But you could see, did anything look like it was burning in my tank? No, you have to train them. Just. Yeah. You know what my trick is with that? The trick is that I put things next to each other, and if they die, they die, and I don't do that again. And if they live, then that works. Yeah. What's that?
Welcome to the Thunderdome.
Right. Yeah, I do the same thing like with orchids. If I see an orchid I like, I buy it and plant it outside. If it lives, yeah. If it dies, won't buy that one again. Yeah, so it's the way, there's no way to really know in advance unless, you try it. Other questions? Oh, come on. Well, anyway, I hope I've inspired you to try something, whether indoors or, outdoors, probably not too practical for most people, but it's another perspective on looking at the reef aquarium hobby or the associated macroalgae or mangrove hobby, and then even Cassiopeia, jellyfish, so kind of cool. Thanks.